Okay, so we're going to talk about basics of web design. And like a lot of the other things we talk about in this class, we could spend an entire semester talking about web design, but we're just going to kind of touch the surface of it and some of the main points, just to kind of give you an idea of like what are the basic principles that we want to use to design web pages that are going to look good and also be good for people to be able to get the information that they need off of the web page. So the web was certainly not the first time that we had to deal with visual design. So people have been dealing with visual design in print for hundreds or thousands of years. And so a lot of the principles that we use to do web design are based on visual design principles that have developed over a long period of time. So these principles tend to be part science, part skill, and part art. And that art part is what scares a lot of people. So a lot of people worry that because they're not a good artist, they're not going to be able to, get a good grade in this class or do a good page. And that's something that you don't have to worry about. So don't worry if you're not an artist. I'm not an artist. Every time that I go to design web pages, though, I really wish I was. I wish I had more artistic tendencies, but I just don't. And so don't worry about if you're not an artist, because in a lot of cases, you can really go a long way toward creating good design by simply not doing certain things. So if you just sort of keep in mind the basic things we'll talk about and just not do certain things, that will be very helpful to you in doing good web design. So talking about some basic design principles, and these are once again borrowed from print, but they work online too. And we're going to go over these one at a time. They are unity, contrast, hierarchy, and consistency. So unity is about what happens in the first 1 or 2 seconds when a person first comes to your page. So this is unity you can kind of think of as being sort of the first impression that somebody gets of a page when they view it for the first time. And so the overall design should give the sense of a coherent whole. So that basically means that everything that's on the page should look like it belongs there, and stuff should look like it belongs together. So colors should go together, fonts should go together, the basic styling of the page should go together, and essentially what you're looking for is coherence. And so you're going to do things like repeating elements. So like I said, you're going to, use the same fonts. One of the things that people get into the habit of is like using a bunch of different fonts when they do a web page because, they think, oh, well, I have access to all these hundreds of different fonts and I'm going to use all 100 of them on one web page. Well, you generally don't want to do that because that's basically just going to create a page that looks like a mess. Instead, what you want to do is pick fonts and basically reuse them on, all the parts of your page. Same thing with colors. So once you've kind of come up with a color scheme for your page, you want to stick with that color scheme. And you don't want to be putting all kinds of different colors on a page that don't belong there or that don't go along with each other. You want to have unity on your page. So using a grid helps a lot. And this is actually something that we probably need to tell people more in print than online, because one of the things that you've already seen is that when you are doing divs, you are essentially creating a grid automatically. And so a grid is simply sort of like a structure. You could think of it as like a scaffold that you would use to sort of build the different parts of the page. And so when we talk about using a grid, we're talking about using a series of boxes to lay out the page. And again, we know that we're already doing this because we are using divs and we're styling the divs. And then essentially what you want to do is position the boxes logically and consistently, and then put content inside the boxes. And, again, the boxes don't always have to be visible. So, just because we say something is a box doesn't mean that it actually has a border around it and that you can actually see the box. It might actually be an invisible box that is just containing something and sort of keeping it positioned on the page so that it lines up with other elements. So as an example here of not using a grid, so here's a sample layout page that doesn't use a grid. And as you can see here, there's stuff basically all over the place. I mean, some of the stuff is centered, some of the stuff is over here to the left. There's really, a sense of incoherence to all of this because we don't have any grid here. But if we basically improve it a little bit by doing something like this, the content is, a lot of it is the same, but now we have a grid. And so you can actually see the grid very much up at the top where we have like the 4 main parts of the page you can go to. And then underneath each one has a little description. And then we also have this little area here where all the text lines up and the copies of the books line up. And the entire page itself, as you can see, is now centered. So we don't have stuff floating along over here on the left-hand page. We don't have any kind of weird stuff like that going on. So having a grid and basically sticking to it is the first design principle that can really help you toward doing a page that's going to look good. So if we take a look at the CNN webpage, we can see some of these elements of Unity and the use of a grid put into practice. So first of all, you'll notice that the fonts are all pretty much the same font family. There might be 2 different font families on this page, but for the most part, if you look at the fonts that are up here in the menu bar and then look at the fonts that are over here in the stories, it's more or less the same font. It's the same font style. The sizing might be a little bit different, but it is the same font. And you can definitely see the grid here, and this is something that we've talked about before in regard to like thinking about web pages as being boxes. You can definitely see, the grid structure coming along down here where you have these different areas, like 3 column areas, and everything is sort of lining up within the columns. And so, again, this is the basics of Unity. And the other thing you'll notice is there's very subtle color. The background of the page is not quite white. It's a very light gray, and you can see that we also have some light grays here in some of the headlines. And then we have black. We have the red CNN, which kind of pops out. One of the bad things about talking about web design is we really can't get past the ads. And so I'm, for the most part, ignoring the ads because the ads obviously aren't necessarily going to constrain to using the same fonts and using the same color. But you do get a sense here overall of what we're talking about when we're talking about this concept of Unity. And when you first come to this page, when it first pops up, you do get the sense of like, okay, this is a page where everything belongs together. So then our next principle is contrast. And with contrast, we're basically saying that we want to have individual elements stand apart from one another on the page. So we're saying that we want individual elements of a page design to be easily distinguishable from one another. And what we can do to make this happen is do things like using boldness, color, size, and positioning. So you might be thinking now, this is sort of the opposite of what you just said about Unity, because we were talking about Unity and we're basically saying that everything should look like it belongs together, and now I'm talking about contrast and I'm saying that stuff should stand apart from one another. Well, these 2 things really aren't in conflict because Unity is essentially what happens like in the first 1 or 2 seconds when somebody comes to a page. And then contrast is basically what happens like 2 to 3 seconds and beyond. So, think about when you first look at a web page, when you first look at any sort of new sort of web page design, the first thing you do for the first couple of seconds is just kind of like get your bearings, like what is this? And then after that, within a couple of seconds, you're going to want to start looking for stuff. And you're going to want to look for individual elements on a page. And so this is what contrast is about. Contrast is basically about making it so that, the individual elements on a page stand apart from one another. And I have an example of this that actually came well, I don't know when it happened, but it's been, I think, about a year. And you don't care about that anyway. But this is essentially, I got this from my prescription drug place, which is Caremark, I believe. And essentially what they're talking about here is they redesigned their label. And if you look at this, if you look at the old label, you can see that it basically was sort of very gray. And really, all the information was there, like the name of the drug, like how much to take, whether you have refills. But it was just all formatted in a way where it sort of all ran together. And nothing here really stands out from other stuff on the page. But then if you look at the new label, you can see that they've redesigned it in such a way that now, the most dominant element you can see is take 1 tablet twice daily. So that's your dosage. It has your name at the top. And then if you want to know the name of the drug, it has it right here along with the dosage amount. And then we also have other information about how to contact them, which is more nicely laid out over here. And then the kind of stuff that you don't really need to know that often. So what date was this filled? When should you discard it? Who manufactured this? And then some other technical information is basically all over here, and it's all very small. So what they did with this new label is they just made the layout and they made the contrast much better. Because now you can see that individual elements stand apart from one another, and it isn't just sort of like a mass of gray text like this one up here. So once again, if we take a look at the CNN webpage, you can see that we have contrast going on because you've got this main big dominant story that is up here, and so it has sort of a big picture with it. It's got big text for a headline. You can see that it subtly has the gray box around it that is creating separation from other elements on the page. And then over here, we have links to different top stories. Then down here, we sort of have like a big story of the day, which happens to be about the Super Bowl. And so there's a picture with that and links there. And, once again, this does like a pretty nice job of making stuff stand apart from one another. And the same thing when we scroll down here through the grid. We basically have a tech section, we have an entertainment section, we have a sports section, and so on and so forth. And so what we're doing there with contrast is basically making it easy to see the different parts of the page. And if we look at ESPN, ESPN is doing the same sort of thing. So ESPN, they have their scoreboard up here across the top. This is an ad. Your main story is right here, and it has a dominant picture video element, and then also the headline here. Then the rest of our top headlines go right here in this box. And then as we scroll down the page, we get to, different sorts of sub-stories. And then over here on the right-hand side, they do a lot of stuff where they're showing their latest tweets and information like that. But once again, look at the use of boxes, look at the use of color, and essentially what they're doing there is creating contrast so that it's easy to see like what the different elements on the page are. So one more thing we can do along the lines of contrast, and this is kind of like a pet peeve of mine, is I have it here, we should keep them separated. So what you want to do is you basically don't want text running up against edges of things. So for example, I have this text here which is placed in a light blue box with a black border around it. And on this left-hand side, you can see that the text is basically running like right up against the edge of that border. And it looks awkward. I mean, it looks crowded. It's difficult to read. It just looks sloppy. And then in this one over here on the right, what we've done is we've just added up a little bit of margin, or I should say added in a little bit of margin here around the text so that now it isn't running like right up against the edge. And you can just see that this is just a much cleaner, nicer looking layout than this. And it also is creating separation and it's creating contrast, because this over here tends to just kind of like devolve into like a big mess, whereas this you can pretty much see like the separation between the box and the text itself. So this is one of the things I'm going to be looking at on some of your designs is, avoid having text running like right up against the edges of boxes or the edges of color changes or things like that. So our next concept is hierarchy. And hierarchy basically says that elements should dominate the page according to their importance. So this means that if something is more important, it should be more dominant on the page. If something is less important, it should be less dominant on the page. So generally speaking, it's good to have a single dominant element in any kind of design. So once again, those of you who have had Kelly Taylor's class or who have had other classes where you talk about design, you probably talked about, this idea of, in a lot of cases, it's good to have a dominant element that draws your eye to it and sort of helps, basically make a design look pleasing. Now, the thing that's a little different is it doesn't necessarily have to be a graphic. In print, a lot of times your dominant element is going to be a graphic. But online, in a lot of cases, we're going to use text instead. Now, having said that, we also do use graphics as dominant elements online as well. But what I'm saying there is it doesn't have to be a graphic necessarily. And so if we come back to our ESPN page, you can see once again that I would argue that the dominant element is this picture, the picture of Cam Newton after the Super Bowl. And it sort of flows very nicely into this headline then. You could also make the argument that this Acura ad is pretty dominant, which it is. And that's by design as well, because the advertisers are paying a lot of money for this. And so they're saying that we want it to be at least kind of dominant on the page. But again, you can see here that you do have sort of a dominant element. And this is the most important thing on the page. And then as we go through the page, we get to the other headlines, which are smaller. And then as we scroll down the page, then we get to stories that aren't quite as important or timely. And this is the whole idea of when they talk about designing above the fold. And this comes back to the days when newspapers, those days aren't over yet, but the days when, newspaper vending machines, you would see like the front page of the newspaper through the vending machine, and then you'd put your money in and get it. And so the idea of designing above the fold was, since everybody was going to see the above the fold part of that front page, you wanted to put your really exciting and important stuff there. And it's the same kind of thing when we're talking about online, because the above the fold is essentially what do you see before you scroll. And so once again, most people, when they come to a web page, they're going to assume that, okay, the most important stuff's going to be right here. I'm not going to have to scroll. If I want to scroll, I can, but you don't want to make people scroll to have to find the most dominant element on the page. So same thing with CNN. Once again, dominant element here is a graphic, and you can also see that this text is very dominant. Then I would argue that probably the second most dominant thing is this Super Bowl story. And then we kind of go over here to our other top stories and news and buzz. And then once again, we come down below the fold and we get into the grid section that has some of the other elements in it as well. And then our final design element is consistency. And consistency basically just says you should carry a consistent design across all the pages on a site. So individual pages on a site should look like they belong together. And what you want to do here is establish a site identity, and that means like a look to a site, and then stick to it. And one of the cool things here, once again, about the way we do stuff online is our CSS style sheets are going to help a lot here. Because, as we already know, we can use a CSS style sheet across multiple pages. So if I have my design set up in my style sheet, and I have all of my other pages linking to that style sheet for the design, that's going to give us consistency across different pages. So again, the idea of consistency is that different pages on a site should look like they belong with one another. So if we look at the ESPN website, we have already spent a lot of time looking at the home page. But if we click one of the links to stories here, we can see that the story pages are, again, it doesn't look exactly like the home page, but the fonts are consistent. We do have this navigation bar across the top, which has stayed the same, and we also have our scoreboard, which has stayed the same. But essentially, even though there are some differences between this page and the home page, the overall design does look like those pages belong together, which is what you want. Okay, so those are our 4 main design principles, and now let's talk a little bit about fonts. And fonts are essentially our different styles of text that we can use on the page. And we have a few main types of fonts that we can use. So the first type of font is what is called the serif font. And an example of a serif font is Times New Roman. And the reason that it is called a serif font is if you look on the letters here, if you look at the edges of the letters, like here on the F, it has these little tabs. And the same thing on the R, there's a tab here and a little tab here. And on the S, you have these little tabs or nubs. Those are actually called serifs. And the reason that we have serifs is they have done studies that show that serifs help when you're reading something. And so serifs sort of help guide the eye from one letter to the next and from one word to the next. And so traditionally, like most printed material is going to be in a serif font. So if you pick up a magazine or a newspaper or a book and basically just look at the main body of the text, chances are is going to be set in a serif font. Because once again, when it comes to print, that has been like the dominant font and the most easy to read font for long text passages. Then we also have the sans serif font. And the sans serif comes from French, which sans basically means without. I guess it's sans or it's sans serif. I don't know. I don't remember anything about French from my college days. But anyway, a sans serif font does not have the serifs. And so if you look at these two fonts, you can see that that is indeed the case, because up here on the serifs, we do have the little serifs, and on the sans serif, we don't. Common sans serif fonts are Helvetica and Arial. And once again, sans serif fonts are very common. And one of the things that they have found is online, serif fonts are not necessarily easier to read than sans serif fonts. So online, we will see in a lot of cases longer text passages that are in either a serif font or a sans serif font. And just not to get too nerdy about this or anything, but essentially what they found is because the screen resolution of a computer is less than the resolution of a book page, the serifs don't actually play that same function of helping guide your eye. So the bottom line is it's sort of up to you, like whether you want to use a serif font or a sans serif font, whether we're talking about headlines or whether we're talking about longer text passages. But another kind of font we have is the novelty font. And there are all different kinds of novelty fonts. Like this one right here is the infamous Comic Sans. And I'm just not a fan of the Comic Sans for anything, but you definitely wouldn't want to use, Comic Sans for something serious. Like if you were giving somebody an award or something and you like made a plaque for them, you would not want to, put the lettering in that plaque in a sans serif, or in a Comic Sans font. So novelty fonts, and again, there are literally millions of them out there. You can get fonts that are like shaped like, skeletons, where the letters are made up of little skeleton people. There's all kinds of novelty fonts, like a Star Trek font, a Star Wars font. And you just really need to be really careful about ever using any novelty fonts. You really should only use a novelty font if there's a really, 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 really good reason to do it, and if it helps somehow tell the story. Because otherwise, novelty fonts are just going to needlessly kind of call attention to themselves and sort of detract from your design. So I mentioned this also before is, you don't want to use a lot of different fonts on a page. You want to basically stay with 2 to 3 font styles maximum on any given page. So you don't want to have like 20 different fonts on a page. You basically just want to stick to 2 or 3 different font styles and sort of keep it at that. If you don't do that, you basically end up with what we call a ransom note effect. And this is why we call it the ransom note effect, because this is sort of what traditionally ransom notes have looked like a lot of times, where people will just go and cut letters out of magazines in different places and then put them together to spell text. And so you just end up with a bunch of different fonts that, really look like they don't belong together. So the cautionary tale there is don't make your pages look like a ransom note. And the way to do that is by basically just being judicious about how many different kinds of fonts and how many styles of fonts you use on the page. So then another aspect of fonts to talk about is basically the difference between a non-proportional font. And so this is a proportional font here, and this is a non-proportional font. And the main difference is with a proportional font, each letter gets an amount of space based on how wide it is. So for example, like letters like I and T, the lowercase t at least, and L are very narrow letters. So you can see that in a proportional font, they're just going to get like a small amount of space. Whereas, the capital P, lowercase p, O, those are going to be wider letters, and so they get a wider amount of space. And then if you look down here, you'll see that in a non-proportional font, everybody gets the same amount of space. So you end up with, you can see like extra spacing in here between the I and the O and the T and the I. And that's because the I is basically a pretty narrow letter, and it's getting just as much space as a W or an M. And so non-proportional fonts are also sometimes called monospace. And the reason is because monospace means one space. Every letter gets the same amount of space. So generally speaking, we want to use proportional fonts. They look a lot better. They're much easier to read. The only time I ever use non-proportional fonts, and Courier is probably the most used non-proportional font, the only time I ever use it is when I'm doing code, like when I'm showing you code, like on your tutorials. And basically the reason that I do that is because a lot of other people do it, because it sort of just looks like something you would type on a computer when you type it this way. So bottom line, stick with proportional fonts. Avoid non-proportional fonts unless there's a really good reason. And just as a little aside, talking about this idea of how serif fonts are being overtaken by sans serif fonts, about a year ago, or it was actually less than that, Google changed its logo. And Google's logo used to be a serif font, so you can see that it had the little serifs here. It didn't have a lot of serifs, but it had the serifs on the L and on the G here. And they changed to a sans serif font. And once again, the idea here is that sans serif has sort of a bit of a more modern look to it, and it's also something that we're using more and more online. Now, this does not mean that serif fonts are dead, that you should never use them. By no means, that's not true. But I think what we're seeing here is just like a little bit of a trend toward sans serif fonts. Okay, and next up, let's talk about text alignment. So we have a couple of different ways that we can actually align our text. And we're most concerned here with any kind of thing where it's going to be a long text passage. So any sort of thing where somebody's going to have to read through something that's long. So we don't, we don't have to worry as much about things like headlines and subheads as we do like long text passages. And our first kind of text alignment is block left. And what that means is that the left-hand side, as you can see here, lines up. And the right-hand side, we end up with what we call a ragged right margin, because the right-hand side is basically just going to end where words end. This tends to be about the best kind of layout for any kind of long text passage. The reason for that is because the I is always going to come back to the same place. So when you read to the end of the line, you're always going to come back to this exact same space, or this same place here on the left-hand side. And so that is basically one of the reasons why block left is so often used in long text passages. So if you look at, a story that's on a particular website, chances are you're going to see the text set in block left alignment. So as if by magic, here is that ESPN story, and you can actually see that this is block left. So it's aligning here on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, we sort of have the ragged margin. And once again, block left is just really good for something like this, for a story, where you're going to have to read a long text passage. And next up we have block right. And block right is essentially the opposite of block left. In block right, we have basically on the right-hand side, everything is aligned, and on the left-hand side, we have a ragged left margin. I would say that block right is probably the least used alignment. And it really is, it's not easy to read. And the reason is that you sort of get to the end of each line, and each time your eye has to come back to a different space. And so it tends to be like not very readable. And so you want to stay away from block right, at least for long text passages. And then we have centered. And centered is one of those things that's going to be fine for headlines or subheads, but you don't want to like put a text story centered. And so you can see here that in centering, basically each line is going to take up an amount of space based on the lettering. And we have a ragged left and ragged right margin. And once again, if you were to try to read this, you can see that it's difficult to read because, again, each time your eye has to come back to a different place. And so we want to stay away from centered text for long text passages as well. So it would be very rare online to see like any kind of story that would be set in centered text alignment. And then also we have justified. And justified is actually pretty cool, but we need to be careful about it. In justified text, we have both the left and right margins are aligned. And what is happening here is that the computer is subtly adding space in between each line, or in between each word and each letter, to essentially make both the left and right margins line up. The only problem with this is that if we get to the point where we're trying to do like a narrow block of text, a lot of times we'll end up with just really big spaces between the words, and it just looks awkward. So we just kind of need to be careful about that. And you can actually kind of see it even like right here in this fourth line down. You can see that there's like a lot of extra noticeable space in this line. So you just need to be kind of careful about that. But there are times when you can use justified text and get away with it. So then the other thing to talk about is line length. And actually, it should probably be called line width, because what we're talking about here is like how long are our lines of text. And you don't want it to be too long. Like, for example, this top line is probably like, this text is too long, because if you try to read this, you can see that your eye has to go all the way, like way over here, here, and then come all the way back here. And, it basically can just, you can kind of lose your place in the middle of a line. By the same token, this text down here at the bottom is too narrow. And you end up with kind of like a ping-pongy effect, like you're watching a tennis game or something, where your eye is just kind of constantly bouncing back and forth. So an ideal line length, or the sweet spot, is what we call 1.5 alphabets. And so the way we determine that is we take our font. So we choose our font, we choose the size of our font, and then we type 1.5 paragraph or 1.5 alphabets. And so you type A through Z and then A through M, and that's going to give you kind of like the ideal line length for that given font. And you can see here that what we've done is we have set it up so that it is, about this line length. It's a little bit longer than that, but it's, sort of within the realm of that. And once again, we don't have to have it be exactly 1.5 alphabets, but we sort of want it to be like in that vicinity. And once again, just sort of compare the readability of this versus the readability of this or the readability of this. Once again, I would argue that this, once we get past this red line at the top, this is going to be a lot easier to read than either of those other two examples. So you want to think about line length and think about 1.5 alphabets as, again, not being something that, everything has to be 1.5 alphabets, but you just sort of want to be in that vicinity. So then another thing to be aware of is the idea of distracting backgrounds. So backgrounds on a page are another one of those things like fonts. Like once people figure out that they can put like backgrounds on a page, a lot of times they do it without actually thinking about, well, does this actually make the design better? Does it make it easy to read, or does it make it worse? And I would argue that this particular example is very bad because, this was somebody had a cute idea of like, okay, I'm going to have this story here and I'm going to have kind of this faded newspaper background behind it. And you can see here that it just really makes, the text really hard to read. And I'm not even giving you like the entire story here, but you can just see by just trying to read some of this text that it's going to be pretty difficult. And a big reason for that is because we have this needless background that is distracting us. Here's another example which I can't believe actually existed on the internet, but you can see that this is human anatomy and physiology, and this is just a mess. They've just got like too much stuff on the page. The idea of these actual things that you can select here are totally hidden. And so this is basically just a bad example of distracting backgrounds on a page. So similarly, you don't want to have low contrast colors on a page. So in these particular examples, like these are examples where we place text against the background, and because the text and the background are kind of similar brightnesses and contrast, it's kind of difficult to read. And so in each of these examples, you can just imagine like trying to read like long text passages, set up like this. It would be very difficult. And I would sort of come back to this idea of there's a reason that, a lot of text or a lot of web pages are basically white background with black text. The reason is that's probably the easiest text to read. And so, again, there's nothing wrong with black text on a white background. You can experiment, but just keep in mind that you don't want to do something that makes it more difficult to read the text. So then let's talk about, in more detail, about a grid system. And so what we're doing here is we're actually kind of going beyond the grid concept that we talked about that you want to use to design your sites, and we're actually kind of talking about a system. And what we're looking for here is a way that is going to allow us to basically design lots of different kind of things within one page size. And this is going to get into the idea of what is called responsive design. So we're going to talk more about this later in the class, but responsive design is this idea that think about, people are looking at web pages on all different kinds of devices. They're looking at them on full-size computer screens. They're looking at them on phones, on tablets. And what we want to be able to do is design a page once and then basically have it adapt itself to all of these different devices. And that is what responsive design is. And we'll talk about that more later in the semester. But for now, one of the elements of getting toward responsive design is this idea of a grid system. And the sweet spot for current desktop screens is 1024 by 768. And what that means is that most everybody, not everybody, but most everybody has a desktop screen that has a resolution of at least 1024 by 768. They might have something bigger than that, but chances are they don't have something smaller. And so what we do is we consider that 1024 by 768, and we come up with 960 pixels wide for our visual area. And this is sometimes called the 960 grids system. Now you might be wondering, well, why don't we call it, why isn't it the 1024 grid section? Well, I'll show you here. So if you look at a typical web browser, you can see that we don't, our page doesn't go all the way across the full width of the screen. And I've actually made this window a little bit smaller than the screen just to show you. But we have sort of like on the right-hand side, we have these scroll bars here, which are taking up space. We also have the border for our window over here on the left-hand side, which is going to be taking up space. And that's called Chrome. Chrome is essentially like the extra decoration that a web browser puts on so that you can scroll the page and do other stuff. And so the bottom line is, even though our screen and our browser might be 1024 pixels wide, by the time we take out the Chrome on the right side and on the left side, we end up with something that's more like a 1024 by 768. And then, we end up with something that's more like 960 pixels wide, even though we have a total of 1024 by 768. So the grid system allows our pages to be designed in a variety of different ways while always conforming to an overall width of 960 pixels. So in other words, what we're doing here is we're basically using a column system that's similar to print-based newspaper design, and we're fitting different size columns within that 960 pixel grid. So a design that uses a 960 pixel grid will look at least okay on most desktop and laptop machines. So some examples of this. Once again, this is a New York Times page, which I have shaped down to 960 pixels wide. And you can see that within the 960 pixels, we've got columns. And so we've kind of got a 5-column design going here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. And what we can do is we can span content across those columns. But again, at base, this is a 5-column design. Same thing here with Washington Post. We once again here have something that's similar, but the design is like a little different, where we've got sort of a narrower column over here on the left and then wider columns here to the right. Toledo Blade's website, once again, kind of similar. We've got a narrow column in the middle, a wider column over here, and a not quite as wide column over here. And all of these pages that I'm showing you are 960 pixels wide. And so you can see that within that 960 pixels, it gives you lots of different design choices. So for example, if you study this graphic for a while, and you might even want to pause my voice to do that, you'll see that this is showing you like all the different things that you can do with a 960 pixel grid. So you can basically just have, if you're talking about a 12-column grid, you could have 12 columns, each of them 60 pixels wide, or you can have all different combinations of columns. So once again, 960 is a good number because it divides nicely into lots of different designs. And it also, as I said, basically allows us to design a page that will look at least pretty good on most desktop machines, and also prepares us, and I say just prepares us to move into responsive design. So this is a graphic that shows screen sizes, and so this is something that was happening for the first 15 years or so of home computers, where screens were just getting bigger and bigger. Now we've kind of stabilized, and now we're actually moving in the opposite direction, because now more and more people are looking at content on smaller screens. And so you can see that this only goes up to 2011. If we brought this up to 2012 and 2013, I think you'd be seeing the small screens actually popping up a bit more here. Because again, as I said, where a lot of people aren't looking at stuff on a big desktop screen, they're looking at stuff on smaller screens, on a tablet or on a phone or another small device. So, and again, this is just an introduction to the idea of responsive design. We could design several different sites for different devices, and that used to be the way things were done. So you might know that sometimes you would go to the ESPN website, and if you typed ESPN.com on your phone, it would actually take you to a site called m.espn.com. And M meant mobile. And what they had was essentially a totally different site where they had like all the content for mobile phones. And, once again, you can just sort of think about that. That's probably not the best use of time and resources. It gets pretty cumbersome. It can get unmanageable. And so a better approach is to design intelligently once and then have the design adapt to different device sizes. And we've had this around for a while. The first wave of this concept used what is called browser sniffing, where we would use a little bit of JavaScript code that would figure out what kind of device was being used and then would assign different CSS style sheets according to that. So if you were looking like on a really big screen, you would get one style sheet, and if you were looking on a smaller screen, you would get another one. But what we've done is, due to several limitations of this, this has fallen out of favor, and we've had like some better approaches that have developed. And so when we're talking about screen sizes, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at, a large desktop computer. We're looking at a smaller laptop screen, a tablet device, and a phone. And rather than, making one design fit on various screen sizes, we adapt the screen sizes using what we call a column metaphor. And so we change the layout on different screen sizes by changing the number of columns. And so if you look at this graphic, you can see that on a big wide screen, we're going to have 4 columns of content. On a laptop, we're maybe just going to have 3 columns of content. On a tablet, 2 columns, and then on a phone, just 1. And so responsive design is this idea that we're going to be able to adapt our content to different kinds of devices. So responsive design is abbreviated RWD. And so what we do is we use flexible grids, and we'll get into this in more detail, and I'll actually talk about this in person a bit more. But we're going to use flexible or fluid grids. And so rather than setting the sizes of things as absolute values, we're going to use relative values. So rather than saying, for example, I want this page to be 960 pixels wide, we might instead say, I want this page to be like 90% as wide as the browser window. We also are going to be able to adapt our photo sizes according to how big the screen is. We're going to use what are called media queries in CSS to adapt the design elements to different devices. And this is actually pretty cool. When we get into this, I think you'll find it pretty cool. But essentially what we're doing is we're saying, okay, if we're looking at this on a small device, there's going to be some code in our style sheet that basically is going to totally change the look of stuff based on the fact that we're looking at a small device. Now, one of the ways of doing responsive design, and I have mentioned this already, is called Bootstrap. And we're going to get into Bootstrap later in the semester. For now, I will just tell you that Bootstrap uses a 12-column grid. And essentially what we're doing there is we're basically going to be able to come up with all of these different designs based on that 12-column grid. So once again, if we think back to our big screen that we showed a couple of slides back, that screen might have 4 columns. So it would look something like this line right here, where we basically have 4 columns, each of them spanning 3 of the smaller 12 columns. And then on our tablet, we might just have 3 columns. And then on our phone, we might just have like 1 column, which is basically going to be narrower than this graphic, but would basically stretch all the way across the screen. And so everything in Bootstrap is going to be based on applying predefined styles, indicating how many columns you want it to take up. And I'm just going to kind of stop here now because we'll go over this when actually, like I said, when we're in person. But there you go. There is an overview of web page design. So I hope you enjoyed it, and have a nice day.